Hello there guys. You might remember that in November I built this SAS Jeep for the European Theatre of Operations in World War II, and in this video I'm going to be building a diorama for it and the figures that came with it. The first step was just to mock up how I might want the scene to be, and here using some XPS foam I envisaged some kind of wall with some damage to it represented by the curve there, which the SAS figures were sort of cautiously peeking around. And then here represented by the blue foam, perhaps like a farm building or barn or something like that. And one effect that I really wanted to achieve was a feeling of having them in a really enclosed space in sort of a narrow dirt lane or something like that. As an alternative to the wall I could use some sea foam to represent perhaps a bush or similar, but that was the general layout that I wanted. I kept the base as small as possible, partly because of storage space, but also because I found a smaller base makes for a more interesting diorama, and I used some offcuts of foam to mark the centre of the road with some sunken wheel tracks on either side. At the moment that's a little bit high, but it will get thinned down. On my blue foam I started to mark out in pencil a small door and a large door for a barn. And once I was happy with those, I could cut the sections out. Using some old coffee stirrers that I had lying around, I made a barn door by cutting them roughly to length. The horizontal beams that I'm placing here are going to go on the inside, and they're purely to keep the sticks together. One of the big rules of dioramas that I always follow is not to have any large straight edges parallel to any of the edges of the base. So with that in mind I would need the barn face to go on at an angle, and therefore one side to be longer than the other. This was constructed from 6mm XPS foam, PV glued into position and pinned while that glue dried. To add more interest to the face of the barn, I took some very thinly sliced XPS foam and cut it into some small stones to go around the doorways. I believe these are called coin stones. Now I did mess up slightly because when I made my doors I made them fit exactly, forgetting that I had a wooden door frame to go in first. So I had to sand them down slightly and then put them into position. I also used some styrene sheet to make some simple hinges. The blue XPS foam that I've got here is much more compact than the regular XPS foam. It's got a much smoother surface, sort of a high density XPS foam. I got this from Diodump in the Netherlands, and I haven't seen it for sale anywhere else. You can see the contrast between the texture on the blue and the texture on the black stuff, as I use my sculpting tools to carve in some brickwork, some stonework, on this barn. I'm deliberately not drawing any lines with a ruler here. Obviously I'm trying to be as straight as I can, but I'm also recognising that if there is a little bit of sort of natural sag in areas, that will just add to the character of the building, which after all is supposed to be quite an old building. Here you can see things starting to take shape, and I've added a floor for that upper level from some XPS foam, which just happens to be pink because that's an offcut that I had handy. A finer sculpting tool was used to round off the edges of many of the stones. And then to give it some texture, a rolled up ball of aluminium foil was used and rolled across the surface. The roof here was a little bit difficult to make because of course it's sloping away from the front, but also it's narrower on the right hand side than the left hand side because of the angle. I cut the base of that from some styrene sheet and almost got it correct. Then I cut a couple of holes in it to represent some damage to the roof, and use some thin strips of styrene to represent the, not the rafters, but the wood supports underneath. I forget what they're called. Then I marked out and cut a lot of styrene roof tiles. I'm not measuring these here, but I'm simply basing each one on the previous one because I do want some natural variation in their size. These were very slowly glued onto the roof. Of course, going around those holes. And then I cut away some of that styrene representing those wooden supports to make it look like something has come in through the roof. Next up was my trusty AK Light Earth Terrains paste. This is an acrylic paste which you can thin with water, and I used it to cover the road and to try to smooth out some of that large bump in the centre. I used a spare wheel that I had and a spare tank track to make some marks in the terrain, and while the paste was still wet, sprinkled in some stones of various sizes. And here is a mock-up of how I imagine this final scene to be. The tree here is just representing a bush, with the commander figure with the binoculars looking around the corner, and the other guys stacked up behind him. XPS foam is quite absorbent, and it also can get damaged by lacquer thinner, so before anything else I took some artist's acrylic paint, thinned it with some water, and gave the foam a good coating of it. And in fact I used the same mixture on the doors and the styrene hinges. You'll also notice at this point that I've forgotten to add any handles or anything, but I come back and do those later. Of course we'll be able to see into the upper story via the window, so that needs to be painted in black as well. Here's the stone front after a simple blocking of colours with some Tamiya buff XF57 used for the doors and some grey just mixed from white and black for the stonework. And you can see that just by varying the intensity of that paint, when I've airbrushed it, I get quite a lot of natural variation on the stones already. Nevertheless, it was time to manually paint the stones, and to do that I used Vallejo model colour black, white, a light grey blue, and very occasionally a khaki colour. As you can see, despite those colours being quite different, the stones do look quite realistic, and of course they'll blend in even more with future weathering. I took the same approach on the slates for the roof, only this time sticking primarily to the greys. I masked off the wooden doors and gave them one coat of this AK Worn Effects, and then what was supposed to be a green slightly lightened with yellow, but unfortunately I spilt the yellow a little bit as I was mixing the paint and came out with this sort of lime green colour. The Worn Effects allows us to use water to wear away the top layer of paint and reveal the wooden colour, the tan, the buff colour underneath. That is currently quite subtle, but given that I didn't really like that lime green colour, I added a second coat of Worn Effects the next day, and then a coat of pure XF5 green on top of that, with the idea of wearing that back through to either the lime green or the wood to provide a deeper, more worn effect. You can see here as we work away at that, the paint comes away quite easily, so you do have to be a bit careful. Even though it was 24 hours later, I'm not really wearing through to the lime green, I'm tending to go straight back to the base layer. But nevertheless, I think that is quite a nice, subtle, worn paintwork effect. Here you can see I've added a small amount of brass rod to finish off those hinges, plus some shaped styrene sheet for a kind of latch system on the main door. Now, one thing that I haven't done before when I've made a stone or a brick building is do any kind of mortar. I've always wanted to, but I've always been a little bit scared of ruining the building. Anyway, this time I thought I'd give it a go. So I got some wall filler, some poly filler, mixed it with water, and proceeded to smear it on to the stonework. And I must admit, as soon as I put it on, I thought this does look a lot better. Once it's been drying for a very short amount of time, I started to wipe it off with a paper towel. I quickly realised that a paper towel is probably not the best tool for the job here. It tends to get snagged on the stonework itself and you end up with bits of paper all over the place. So a slightly dampened kitchen sponge, dishwashing sponge, is probably a better tool. Now, even with that, you do get a slight white cast over your stonework here. Everything's quite a lot lighter than it was before, but we can work with that. In particular, I did think the mortar itself is a little bit too white, and either I should have brought a different colour polyfiller, or maybe attempted to colour it as I mixed it with some acrylic paint. So the first step I took here was to take some oil paint and do what armour modelers call a dot filter, by putting dots of that all over the stonework and streaking it in a downward pattern to try to dirty things up a bit. As you can see, I'm using grey, brown and black oil paints, and it's doing quite a good job at weathering the stonework. Now, in general, I think that looks quite good, but I still thought that the mortar was a bit too light, and I did have to go over the mortar again, this time with a much more thinned down oil paint wash, and just specifically target the mortar lines. I also took some green and I started at the bottom of the brickwork and worked small amounts of that up to represent sort of grime and mould and so on. Finally, I wanted some rusty hinges, so to do that I took some of this AK Interactive crusted rust deposits, and to give it some more texture I mixed in a small amount of this track rust. This will probably ruin your brush using the pigments like this, so use an old one. And you can see here as I'm doing the bottom hinge that the top two have dried, and they've got some nice variation in colour there from that quite thick pigment. This is my initial attempt at painting the road. I'm not quite sure why I filmed this with a macro lens, but the colour there is a little bit too dry, a bit too yellow, a bit too deserty for my liking. So I did go back. Initially I tried some more grey to make it more like a gravel road. I still wasn't having much joy with that, to be honest, so I went back to good old Tamiya XF52 Flat Earth for a mud road. And I think once I've painted those stones with a Vallejo model colour, it doesn't look too bad. I will also use the pigment which I used on the Jeep to blend in the road and the figures and the building at a later stage. For the foliage down the side of the base, I've taken this tree that I showed you earlier, and rather than using it in the complete state, I've pulled pieces of it out to make sort of shrubs and small plants. I've also used some seafoam and a couple of spare trees that I had left over from my recent Skeletrix diorama, and these were made by coating the seafoam in PVA glue and then putting various types of scatter over the top. I think the key here is to get some variety, and I've gone quite heavy here on the old PVA because there's not a lot of contact surface on the seafoam trees. Now, of course, big hedges like this don't just grow out of the bare ground, they have lots of stuff underneath them. So to try to make it blend better with the base, I took some of this scatter material which I've had for a while. I know this says winter ground cover, but it's got lots of bits that I think are quite relevant to any ground cover really. My first attempt was to take this and mix it with some PVA glue into a paste. That didn't work very well. So instead I put the PVA on the ground, which is probably the much more sensible thing to do, and then sprinkled the scatter over the top. And I think that's done a much better job of representing that hedgerow. I do have some yellow sort of flocking foam material, so I put a small amount of PVA glue on the end of some of the branches and sprinkled the yellow stuff over the top to make it look like flowers, hopefully. At least that's the plan. You'll notice I've also put some small clumps of static grass into the road, and then I used a dark oil paint wash over the road to try to bring out the detail. The roof was also given some glue and some scatter to represent moss. An oil paint wash was also used on the roof to dirty it up a little bit, and equally to blend in those slightly contrasting tiles. The spots that you can see here are me flicking some grey paint onto the roof to represent general weathering, and I also do the same thing with some yellow over the moss, again to represent the different colours of the growth. With that done, the diorama base itself was fairly complete, and it was the figures that I had to work on. As I mentioned in the previous video, the figures came with the Jeep kit, but they are basically a bundled version of this dragon kit, the Second SAS Regiment in France 1944. Now, I haven't shown in great detail how I built and painted these, because to be honest I didn't do a great job of them, and it's a bit of a step backwards I think compared to some of my other figures. However, the base coats were airbrushed, so a buff colour for the jacket and a brown colour, I forget what brown it was, for the trousers. And then I brush painted on the patches of green and brown for the denizen smock that the SAS often wore. I think in this initial painting here I've left a bit too much of the base colour visible, so I did go back and add some more patches there to reduce the amount of tan that was visible. The webbing and the weapons were painted with Vallejo model colour, and then I gave the full figures quite a heavy wash of sepia oil paint thinned with odourless thinner. The reason I went quite heavy on that was to darken that tan, which was a little bit too light, and to just make the uniforms look a bit more used and a bit dirtier. That came out okay, but despite having a matte varnish, the figures did look a little bit too glossy still. So with the aim of blending the road, the building, the figures, etc., and of reducing that glossiness of the figures, I took some of the European earth pigment, which I used on the Jeep originally, applied some to the road and to the bottom of the building, and then some more pigment very lightly over all of the figures. And that just has that effect of taking that shine off. With that done, my model was complete. And there we go guys, that was my diorama of the Second SAS Regiment in France, 1944. As I mentioned in the previous video, I really enjoyed building this Jeep kit, and the diorama was also a huge amount of fun. I definitely spent more time on the diorama than the model itself, but I'm also quite pleased with the fact that I didn't buy anything extra for the diorama. It was all materials that I had in the stash, bought a long time ago in many cases and waiting to be used. I think overall it looks quite realistic. The house in particular I'm pleased with. I did wonder about painting the foliage, the bushes and the trees and so on, and in fact I did give it a light coat at one point, but it didn't really seem to have the effect that I wanted, so I left the rest of them unpainted. The figures I feel were a bit of a letdown compared to my previous figures, but I just need to keep practicing. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, then please do feel free to give it a like, a share or a comment. I do my absolute best to answer all of the comments that are made on my videos. And all that is left is for me to say thank you to all of you for watching. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members for their ongoing support. It's massively appreciated. And until next time, have fun modelling.